Right now, the world is shaped by one man's rise. So what if that moment never happened? Fact 1. A different Russia. In the early 2000s, if Vladimir Putin never came to power, Russia likely would have remained under weaker, more fragmented leadership after the Yeltsin era. That could have meant a continuation of chaotic democracy, corruption still high, oligarchs still powerful, but without a strong centralized authority reasserting control. Some analysts believe Russia might have drifted closer to Europe politically, slowly reforming its institutions. Others argue it could have collapsed further internally, with regional leaders gaining more autonomy. The key difference: Russia would probably look less like a centralized superpower and more like a struggling, unpredictable federation still searching for identity. Fact 2. NATO expansion would face less resistance. Without Putin's confrontational stance, NATO's eastward expansion would likely have continued with far less tension. Countries like Ukraine and Georgia might have moved closer to membership earlier, without triggering the same level of geopolitical backlash. This could have reshaped European security entirely, possibly preventing the militarization of Eastern Europe we see today. However, there's a flip side. A weaker Russian response might have emboldened NATO too quickly, creating instability in different ways. Instead of a cold standoff, the region might have experienced quieter but equally complex political pressure and competition. Fact 3. No Crimea annexation, different Ukraine. One of the most immediate changes: Crimea likely remains part of Ukraine. Without Putin, the strategic decision to annex Crimea in 2014 may never have happened. That means no triggering event for the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict as we know it. Ukraine might have developed more steadily, balancing between Europe and Russia economically. But this doesn't guarantee peace. Internal divisions and political struggles would still exist. The difference is scale. Instead of a global flashpoint, Ukraine might be seen as another complex post-Soviet state, not the center of a major geopolitical confrontation. Fact 4. Energy politics would shift dramatically. Putin used energy as a geopolitical weapon: gas pipelines, supply pressure, and strategic pricing. Without him, Russia's energy policy might have remained more business-oriented rather than politically aggressive. Europe may not have felt the same urgency to diversify energy sources, meaning countries could have stayed even more dependent on Russian gas for longer. Ironically, that could make Europe economically closer to Russia, but also more vulnerable in a different, quieter way. Instead of open conflict, the relationship might resemble a tense business partnership, where both sides rely on each other but trust very little. Fact 5. US-Russia. Relations could have remained cooperative without Putin. Early 2000s cooperation between Russia and the United States might have lasted longer. After 9/11, Russia initially supported US counterterrorism efforts. A different Russian leader may have continued that path, leading to deeper intelligence sharing and less hostility. This could mean fewer sanctions, more trade, and a very different diplomatic tone. However, tensions would not disappear entirely. Conflicting interests would remain. The difference is psychological. Americans might view Russia less as a strategic adversary and more as an unstable partner, changing decades of foreign policy assumptions. Fact 6. Russia's economy might be less controlled, but more uneven. Putin centralized economic power, bringing major industries, especially energy, under state influence. Without him, oligarchs likely retain more control, leading to a freer but more chaotic market. Some sectors might grow faster due to less state interference, attracting Western investment earlier. At the same time, inequality could deepen, and corruption might remain unchecked without a strong central authority. For Americans, this creates a different image of Russia, not a disciplined rival economy, but a volatile market full of opportunity and risk, similar to other emerging economies. Fact 7. China, Russia. Relations would be less strategic. Putin played a major role in strengthening ties with China, especially as tensions with the West increased. Without him, Russia might not pivot as strongly toward Beijing. This could weaken the current geopolitical alignment that challenges US influence globally. China might stand more isolated in strategic competition with the United States, without Russia as a reliable partner. On the other hand, a weaker Russia could become economically dependent on China in a quieter way. Either outcome shifts the global balance, but in both cases the tight anti-Western coordination we see today would likely be reduced. Fact 8. The global perception of democracy could look different. Putin's model of centralized power influenced how other countries view governance, showing that strongman leadership can restore stability after chaos. Without that example, some nations might lean more toward democratic reforms instead of authoritarian consolidation. This could strengthen democratic norms globally, especially in post-Soviet states. However, there's another possibility. If Russia had remained unstable and weak, it might serve as a warning against rapid democratization. For Americans, this changes the narrative. Russia becomes either a success story of reform or a cautionary tale of disorder, shaping global political debates. Fact 9. The Second Chechen War might have ended differently. Putin's rise was closely tied to the Second Chechen War, where he built his image as a strong leader restoring order. Without him, Russia's response to Chechnya could have been less centralized and possibly more negotiated, reducing long-term violence. That might have prevented some of the heavy civilian casualties and global criticism. However, a weaker response could also allow instability to spread in the North Caucasus, potentially creating a prolonged insurgency. For Americans, this raises a hard question. Is stability achieved through force more effective than uncertain peace through compromise? Fact 10. Global cyber warfare might have developed more slowly under Putin. Russia became a major player in cyber operations, influencing elections, infrastructure, and information systems worldwide. Without his leadership, Russia's cyber strategy might have remained less coordinated and less aggressive. This could reduce fears around election interference, especially in the United States. But it would not eliminate cyber threats entirely. Other countries and non-state actors would still evolve. The difference is timing and scale. Instead of a dominant cyber rival, the US might face a more fragmented digital threat landscape, delaying the urgency of cybersecurity reforms. Fact 11. Russian media would likely be less controlled. Putin's government gradually brought major media outlets under state influence, shaping public narratives inside Russia. Without him, independent media might have survived longer, creating a more open but also more chaotic information environment. This could allow greater political competition and public debate. At the same time, misinformation and oligarch-controlled narratives might dominate without clear regulation. For American observers, Russia might look less like a tightly controlled system and more like a noisy, unstable democracy, raising a different kind of concern about how truth and power interact. Fact 12. Military modernization would be weaker or delayed. Putin invested heavily in rebuilding Russia's military after the decline of the 1990s. Without his leadership, modernization programs could be slower, underfunded, or poorly coordinated. This would reduce Russia's ability to project power globally, including in places like Syria. For the United States, that might mean fewer direct confrontations and less strategic tension. However, a weaker military could also make Russia less stable internally, increasing the risk of fragmented security forces or regional conflicts. Less strength does not always mean less danger. It can sometimes mean less control. Fact 13. The Syrian war could have taken a different course. Russia's intervention in Syria in 2015 was a turning point that helped preserve Bashar al-Assad's government. Without Putin, that intervention may never have happened, or would be far less decisive. This could lead to a faster collapse of the Syrian regime, or a prolonged, more chaotic conflict involving multiple factions. For the United States, this changes the entire Middle East dynamic. Fewer direct confrontations with Russia, but potentially more instability on the ground. It raises a difficult reality. Sometimes intervention stabilizes, and sometimes the absence of it creates even deeper uncertainty. Fact 14. European security. Spending would likely be lower. Without Putin's actions in Ukraine and his broader confrontational posture, many European countries might not have increased military spending so rapidly. NATO members may have continued relying more heavily on the United States for defense, delaying investments in their own armed forces. For Americans, this creates a different burden, potentially even greater financial and military responsibility for European security. On the other hand, reduced tensions might mean fewer flashpoints and less immediate risk of conflict. The question becomes whether lower spending reflects peace, or simply unpreparedness for future crises. Fact 15. The idea of a new Cold War might never resurface. Putin's leadership revived a sense of rivalry between Russia and the West that many believed ended in the 1990s. Without him, this narrative might never fully return. US foreign policy could focus more on China or the Middle East, without dividing attention toward Russia as a primary competitor. However, this also removes a unifying external threat that has historically shaped Western alliances. For Americans, the absence of a clear rival can create strategic uncertainty, less tension, but also less clarity about global priorities and long-term security planning. Fact 16. Russia's political succession could be more fragmented. Putin created a system centered heavily around his leadership, ensuring continuity through strong control. Without him, Russia might experience frequent leadership changes, coalition governments, or internal power struggles. This could open the door to more democratic processes, but also instability at the highest levels of government. Policies might shift unpredictably, making long-term agreements with other countries more difficult. For the United States, dealing with a constantly changing Russian leadership could be both an opportunity for influence and a challenge for consistent diplomacy. Fact 17. Sanctions and economic isolation would be far less severe. Much of Russia's current economic isolation stems from decisions made under Putin, especially after 2014 and 2022. Without those actions, Western sanctions would likely be far more limited or non-existent. This could mean stronger economic ties between Russia and the United States, including trade and investment opportunities. However, deeper integration also brings dependency. American businesses might become more exposed to Russian market risks. Instead of a clearly defined adversary economy, Russia could be a complicated partner where cooperation and competition exist at the same time. Fact 18. The global nuclear conversation could be less tense, but not safer. Putin frequently uses nuclear rhetoric as part of strategic messaging, increasing global anxiety. Without him, nuclear threats might be less visible in public discourse, reducing fear among global audiences. However, the underlying reality would remain. Russia would still possess one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals. A less assertive leadership might engage more in arms control agreements with the United States, potentially extending treaties and building trust. But reduced visibility of threats can also lead to complacency, making nuclear risks less discussed, even if they are still very real. Fact 19. The Baltic states would feel less immediate threat. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have built much of their modern security policy around fear of Russian aggression under Putin. Without him, that pressure might be significantly lower. These nations could focus more on economic development rather than defense readiness. For the United States, this reduces the urgency of NATO's eastern presence. However, a less assertive Russia does not eliminate historical tensions. The Baltic states might still seek protection, but with less intensity, raising a difficult question. Does reduced fear create stability, or does it lower vigilance against future risks? Fact 20. Russian influence. In Eastern Europe would decline more gradually. Putin actively worked to maintain influence over former Soviet states through pressure, incentives, and sometimes force. Without him, Russia's influence in Eastern Europe might fade more slowly and less aggressively. Countries like Moldova, Armenia, and Belarus could drift toward Europe without facing the same level of confrontation. This could reduce conflict in the region. At the same time, a weaker Russian presence might create power vacuums where political instability grows. For Americans, it changes the narrative from direct confrontation to a quieter competition over influence that is harder to define and harder to control. Fact 21. US domestic politics might look different. Allegations of Russian interference in US elections became a major political issue in recent years. Without Putin's leadership and the strategic direction behind such actions, this factor might be far less significant. American political debates could focus more on internal divisions rather than external influence. However, removing a foreign actor does not remove polarization itself. For Americans, this raises an uncomfortable reality. How much of political conflict is driven by outside forces, and how much originates from within? Without Russia as a focal point, that question becomes harder to avoid. Fact 22. Global information. Warfare would be less centralized. Russia under Putin developed coordinated strategies for influencing narratives abroad through media and digital platforms. Without that centralized approach, information warfare might still exist but be less organized and less effective. Other countries and groups would still participate, but without a dominant model shaping the field. This could reduce the scale of global disinformation campaigns. On the other hand, a fragmented environment might be harder to track and regulate. For the United States, the challenge shifts from confronting a clear opponent to navigating a more unpredictable and decentralized information landscape. Fact 23. Russia's national identity would evolve differently. Putin reshaped Russia's identity around strength, sovereignty, and resistance to Western influence. Without him, that narrative might develop in a less defined and more internally contested way. Russia could lean more toward integration with global institutions, or struggle with competing visions of its future. This internal debate could create openness but also instability. For Americans, Russia might appear less predictable, not because of confrontation, but because of uncertainty. A country without a clear direction can be less threatening in the short term, but more difficult to understand in the long term. Fact 24. The risk of a large-scale war in Europe could be lower, but not eliminated. Putin's decisions significantly increased the risk of large-scale conflict in Europe. Without him, that immediate risk might be reduced, especially regarding Ukraine. However, underlying tensions, territorial disputes, historical grievances, and competing alliances would still exist. A different leadership could delay or reshape conflict rather than prevent it entirely. For the United States, this changes strategic planning. Less urgency, but not less responsibility. The absence of one leader does not erase the structural forces that drive conflict. It only changes how and when they might emerge. Fact 25. Russia's defense. Industry would be less dominant globally under Putin. Russia remained one of the world's top arms exporters, supplying weapons to countries across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Without his centralized push to rebuild the military-industrial complex, that position might weaken. Other suppliers, especially the United States and China, could take a larger share of the global arms market. For Americans, this could mean stronger influence in global defense partnerships. However, it also risks concentrating power among fewer suppliers, potentially increasing global dependency on US systems and drawing America deeper into regional conflicts. Fact 26. Internal protests. In Russia might be more visible and frequent. Putin's government has tightly controlled political opposition and public protests. Without that level of control, Russia might experience more frequent demonstrations, political movements, and civic activism. This could lead to gradual democratic reforms or, alternatively, prolonged instability if competing groups struggle for power. For Americans, this presents a familiar dilemma, supporting democratic expression abroad, while recognizing that rapid political change can also create uncertainty. A more open Russia might look closer to Western values, but also more unpredictable in how those values are implemented. Fact 27. The global balance of power could shift more toward the United States. Putin's Russia reasserted itself as a global counterweight to US influence. Without that resurgence, the United States might face fewer direct geopolitical challenges in Europe and parts of the Middle East. This could strengthen American leadership globally. At the same time, the absence of a strong rival can create strategic overextension. The US might take on more responsibilities, facing pressure to intervene in conflicts without a balancing force. For Americans, this raises a critical debate. Is dominance a position of strength, or a burden that stretches resources too far? Fact 28. Russia's relationship with global institutions would likely be stronger. Without Putin's confrontational approach, Russia might maintain closer ties with organizations like the G8, World Trade Organization, and international financial systems. This could lead to deeper economic integration and more consistent diplomatic engagement with Western countries. For the United States, this creates opportunities for cooperation on global issues such as climate change and security. However, integration also brings complexity. Shared systems mean shared risks. A more connected Russia might be easier to work with, but also harder to isolate if tensions eventually arise. Fact 29. The image of Russia in American society would be less hostile. Public perception matters. Under Putin, Russia is often viewed in the United States as a strategic adversary. Without his leadership and the events tied to it, that image could be less defined by conflict. Cultural exchange, business, and tourism might play a larger role in shaping how Americans see Russia. However, a less hostile image does not guarantee trust. Historical rivalry and ideological differences would still influence perceptions. The difference is emotional intensity. Russia might be seen less as a threat and more as a complex, uncertain partner. Fact 30. The lessons America draws from Russia would be completely different. Today, Russia under Putin is often used as a case study in centralized power, political control, and geopolitical rivalry. Without him, the lesson might shift entirely. Russia could be viewed either as a country that successfully transitioned after the Soviet collapse, or as one that struggled without strong leadership. For Americans, this changes the narrative used in debates about governance, security, and global strategy. Instead of pointing to Russia as a clear example of strength or threat, it becomes a more ambiguous case, one that invites debate rather than simple conclusions. Fact 31. Russia's elite power structure would be more fragmented. Putin consolidated power among security services and loyal elites, creating a relatively stable inner circle. Without him, Russia's elite structure would likely remain divided between oligarchs, regional leaders, and political factions competing for influence. This fragmentation could allow more pluralism, but also increase the risk of internal power struggles. For Americans, this presents a different kind of challenge, not a single predictable rival, but multiple actors with shifting agendas. Stability might decrease, and with it the ability to anticipate Russia's actions on the global stage. Fact 32. The Arctic region could become less militarized. Under Putin, Russia has heavily invested in Arctic military infrastructure, viewing the region as strategically critical. Without that leadership, Arctic policy might focus more on economic development and international cooperation rather than military presence. This could reduce tensions with NATO countries and lower the risk of conflict in the region. However, it might also slow Russia's ability to secure its claims and resources, opening the door for increased competition. For the United States, this creates both opportunity and uncertainty in one of the world's most resource-rich frontiers. Fact 33. Global populism might have one less model to follow. Putin's style of leadership has influenced political movements worldwide, demonstrating how centralized authority can coexist with electoral systems. Without that example, some leaders might not adopt similar approaches, potentially slowing the rise of certain populist trends. This could strengthen democratic institutions in some regions. At the same time, dissatisfaction with globalization and inequality would still exist, meaning other models could emerge. For Americans, this raises a key question. How much do global political trends depend on individual leaders versus deeper social forces? Fact 34. Long-term US-Russia. Trust could be higher, but still limited. Without decades of escalating tensions under Putin, trust between the United States and Russia might be stronger at the institutional level. There could be more consistent cooperation on arms control, counter-terrorism, and global crises. However, historical rivalry, ideological differences, and competing interests would still limit full trust. For Americans, this creates a more nuanced relationship, not defined by open hostility, but also not fully cooperative. The absence of clear confrontation might make the relationship seem calmer, but also more complex and harder to define. Fact 35. The world would not be safer, just differently unstable. Removing one leader does not remove the forces that shape global conflict. History, geography, economics, and power competition would still exist. Without Putin, some major crises might never happen, especially in Ukraine, but other forms of instability could emerge. Weaker central control in Russia, regional conflicts, or unpredictable leadership changes. For Americans, this challenges a simple assumption that one individual defines global security. The reality is more complex. The world might feel less tense in some ways, but uncertainty would still remain, just in a different form. So would the world be safer or just unpredictable in a completely different way? You decide.